Dr. Stephen Blank, someone I've known for a very long time. Vlad Socor, Senior Fellow of the Jamestown Foundation, one of the anchors of our publication, Eurasia Daily Monitor, someone who is forward deployed in Munich, and sometimes referred to as Jamestown's unofficial Secretary of State. So he's constantly traveling, and is, once he returns from his travels, is always writing, and for the Jamestown Foundation. And our last speaker will be the noted authority, Paul Goble, who is the best expert in this country, I think, on the Baltic states, respected, revered, and very much followed closely by his Windows blog on Eurasia. We always look to Paul to see what he has to say about this region and the changing security dynamics, and I'm sure everyone has a lot to say after hearing the first panel this morning. Stephen Blank is a noted military expert on the Russian military, and there's no better person to start the first talk today in the first part of our discussion on the Russian threats to Baltic security. Dr. Blank, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenn. It's a great honor to be here. Let me begin by saying two things. First, I was trained as a historian, and then I spent most of my professional life as a military strategic analyst. If we're going to talk about Russian threats to the Baltic, the subject of this panel, we need to think soberly and precisely without hysteria about the situation, because while the threats are real and serious, and more importantly, long-lasting, they didn't begin in February 2014, that we also need to think in a calm, rational, analytic way if we are to come up with an understanding of the threat, and equally importantly, if not more so, an understanding of what needs to be done from a strategic point of view, not simply a laundry list of policies that need to be done, but an integrated strategy. Now, certain facts have to be stated at the outset in this context. First of all, and Baltic and NATO ministers have already said this even before Ukraine, Russia possesses conventional superiority in the Baltic theater. This is a fact. And it's probably never going to change simply because of the geography involved. But we have to start from that recognition. Second, as we've noted, it's clearly unreconciled to the post-Cold War settlement and the treaties that it has signed. But, and here I agree with Kurt, few analysts expect a purely military threat. Certainly not imminently. And there's a number of reasons why. One, I think Putin does believe that it would lead to Article 5 and a protracted war. He cannot afford a protracted war now. He doesn't have the economic resources, thanks to sanctions and everything else. And secondly, because the Russian military is not ready for this. If you look at the actual performance of the Russian military in Ukraine, Crimea is a place which had unique advantages, and they were able to do a coup de main in February of 2014. The Donbass and Luhansk, where they're fighting, the performance of the rebels and of the Russian military is considerably less inspired. And what's more, it's not hybrid in any way, shape, or form. It is conventional Russian artillery tactics pounding these poor people into submission by sheer numbers and mass. And given the problems afflicting the Ukrainian army, they've been able to do that. But they've taken enormous casualties. They're spending an enormous amount of money, and they are in no position to start another war in the Baltic. Furthermore, they have domestic and other threats. Many of you are aware of the fact that the Kadyrov affair is now exploding in Moscow's face. There are reports already from last night that Kadyrov has ordered his troops home from Ukraine. And if Kadyrov is going to say to the Russians, you can't come into the North Caucasus, we have 40,000 or so armed forces in there who are prepared to fight another war with the Russians, who are already fighting an insurgency in the North Caucasus. Furthermore, in Central Asia, the Russian military is extremely, and I don't use that term lightly, extremely alarmed about the situation in Afghanistan, as the New York Times reported today. We should be too, because the whole U.S. strategy has gone up in smoke, not unexpectedly. And the U.S. is now fighting again in Afghanistan. The Russians are claiming, as are Central Asian governments, that Taliban forces have crossed into Central Asia. And Russian press accounts are talking about undertaking preventive or precautionary actions in Central Asia. This is a country that could be in 2 or 3 fronts quite soon, and it doesn't have the manpower or capability even to bring Ukraine to a decisive end. So the threat of a military invasion is not imminent. Imminent does not mean, however, that it does not exist. What we do see is constant, growing, qualitative capability of the Russian military, land, sea, air, electronic, cyber, nuclear, to bring pressure to bear, not just on the Baltic states, but across the entire front of NATO, from the Baltic to the Black Sea, in fact. You're all familiar with the threats. I'm not going to go into them. But what we do see, and we've seen this for a long time, is a consistent and coherent use of what military analysts in this country call the DIME, the categories of power, diplomacy, information, military, and economics, to undermine the Baltic states, undermine NATO and EU cohesion, break up, as was said before, NATO, even if formally it remains on paper, and the European Union, and to separate the United States from Europe. And this strategy, at least until recently, has enjoyed a fair measure of success. And there are still elements of success, too, because it's very clear that there are people in Europe who want to eliminate the sanctions. And even in the United States, we don't take the threat seriously enough. So the Russian strategy is to undermine the whole process of European integration, leaving Russia the strongest military power in Europe and one that has a veto power on anything the West wants to do. And it will use any method to do that, as long as that method offers some promise of victory, and secondly, can be done effectively, that is, without bringing Russia into a protracted war, which, as Putin, I think, and knows, because he is, after all, like us, a student of Russian history, protracted wars are not good for Russia. And they're certainly not good when the economy is heading south, as is the case. So the threat includes military pressure and the threat of a classic conventional invasion, but is by no means restricted to that. Therefore, when you look at all the elements of power, they were talked about in the last panel, so I don't have to repeat them all for you, and you've seen them in the press, in scholarly analyses, and everywhere else, we need to understand what is afoot, and what we need is real strategy, not rhetoric. And we need much stronger leadership both here in town and in Brussels. What is needed in terms of strategic response to the Russian threat? The threat, we know what it is. We've already seen it, and the ethnic issue is part of it. The energy issue is part of it. The constant information barrage, the use of energy, money, and other money to subvert, criminalize, and corrupt governments across Europe, from Great Britain to Turkey, including the Baltic states and the major parties. The use of heightened espionage to a degree not seen since the Brezhnev and Andropov years, and of course the constant information warfare and so on, all add up to a strategy that is being followed. I don't like the term hybrid warfare. First of all, in Ukraine, there is no hybrid. There are essentially artillery duels of the very old-fashioned sort in Donetsk and Luhansk. Secondly, it's a term that is nowhere to be found in Russian military literature. You ask a Russian military officer, hybrid warfare, he'll look at you in incomprehension. The strategy of bringing to bear all these elements of power in a consistent way, or asymmetric way, as we would call it, to keep the threshold below an Article 5 intervention of NATO, however, does have a pedigree. It's innovative tactically. It's innovative in its use of new technological inventions, both civil and military. But it is a strategy whose origins happen to be the 1920s and 30s. Because at a time when the Soviet Union could not afford to fight a major war in Europe, although it expected one, believed itself to be surrounded by hostile capitalist states. That was what capitalist encirclement meant, after all. What's more, believed that those capitalists had what you would call today a fifth column inside the Soviet Union, and they were the same people, as does Putin. They resorted to a strategy that used all these instruments of power. And if you study Soviet strategy in the 20s and 30s, you'll see it. That strategy was largely carried out at home in terms of the industrial and military buildup and the massive repressions of the Stalinist period. But abroad, it was carried out by the Comintern, which had been taken over by the NKVD and OGPU. In other words, this is a strategy that was originated or evolved not just under Stalin, but was carried out by the guys who taught Putin what he knows today, or that they taught Putin's teachers. In other words, this is not just a military strategy, it's a, to use a Washington phrase, whole of government strategy. Now, it's natural we have difficulty responding to this because we have our system is one of dispersed and fragmented power. That's just the nature of the beast. On the other hand, the other problem is that we have on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue people who are still either unwilling or unable to come to terms cognitively or practically with the threat. So, what needs to be done? A, Ukraine needs to be armed. We've talked about that. I'm happy to answer questions, but Ukraine's not the subject of today's discussion. B, the Ukrainian state needs to be sustained financially and economically as it is pressured, if necessary, to enact the necessary reforms. 3, the sanctions on Russia have to stay at a minimum, and I would even increase them. 4th, the United States needs to accelerate the process of energy exports to Europe to come after Russia and Gazprom, and Rosneft, which are already in serious trouble, and make things even worse for them. 5th, conventional rearmament has to take place both here and across Europe, as the previous speakers pointed out. We are not going to get Congress to allocate more money for defense if the Baltic states' threat perception is one that says 2% of GDP is enough, because that means they don't take the threat seriously for all their complaining and rhetoric. At the end of the day, everybody who served in the government, and there are many of you here, knows that the budget is the true indicator of what you think is important. And if only 2% of your GDP is going to national security, you don't think it's important. We need to do more on that end. They do too. But beyond conventional rearmament, and the rearmament that means the permanent deployment in Europe, it means also, as Kurt Volker said, permanent deployment in Poland and the Baltic states without having to tear up the founding act of 1997, the NATO-Russia agreement, because the Russians have violated every arms control and every other treaty in the book, and we can point that out to them and they can scream all they like, but the facts remain the case. Instead, if you read today's or yesterday's newspaper, we're actually withdrawing aircraft from Europe. That tells you how seriously, in effect, we do take the threat. And we're not going to get the Europeans to expend more money on defense if we're doing less also. And we cut defense spending last year, as SIPRI reported. Beyond that, there are moves finally afoot, both in NATO and in Europe and here, to come up with some sort of information strategy. Now, the private sector people is not going to cut it. CNBC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox are not going to hire a bunch of trained Russian linguists and start broadcasting soap operas and news in Russian. And if you believe that, my hometown has a bridge for you. There's only one element in town that's going to do it, and it's going to cost money, and it's the US government. And if you talk to Radio Free Europe or VOA, the visible demoralization is, overwhelming. But it needs to be overcome, and there has to be a strategy, not just simply writing a check, but a strategy and reorganization of these groups to carry out information programs. And we need to bring back organizations like USIA. Therefore, we need a counter-information warfare program. I've talked about economics, I've talked about military, I've talked about diplomacy. Insofar as European security is concerned, we need to increase European integration, not stop, as the European Union is doing. I think we need to make overtures in the Balkans to Serbia, because I believe that they would be welcomed. I believe we need to have a much deeper engagement with Turkey, because Turkey now in the Black Sea is clearly threatened, and I think they begin to realize that. And I think the bloom is off the rose in some respects of the Russo-Turkish Entente. We need to strengthen the Balkan military sector as well. Things are happening in the Black Sea along those lines, but it needs to happen. In the Baltic, what needs to be done? Apart from permanent deployment and increased conventional rearmament, not just by the US, but by everybody else as well, and a coherent strategy, we need to launch a major diplomatic offensive that includes A, bringing Sweden and Finland as close as possible to membership, if not actual membership, if that's really too difficult. B, there has to be a much bigger, stronger, more robust pursuit of the TTIP in order to create greater economic integration among our allies and to provide the legislative basis for exporting oil and gas to Europe in order to check Gazprom. Furthermore, we're going to have to address the issue of nuclear weapons in Europe. Now, that's a very vexed issue. It can't be solved in 2 seconds here in a speech, but it's going to be on the agenda, particularly if the Iran agreement goes through, because the stated reason for missile defense is to defend against Iran. If the agreement with Iran is carried out, I'm not here to discuss the merits or demerits of that, but if it's carried out, and you see this already in the Russian press, Russia's going to demand that they be taken out, because then we don't have a leg to stand on unless we get up there and say what we should have always said: they're for you. You richly deserve that, even though physically it's impossible to use those bases right now against Russian missiles. In other words, what is necessary here? Strategic, sober-minded, but vigorous leadership. We need to think precisely about what this war is, because the war that we see in Ukraine now is a classic conventional war. It's not a hybrid war. And although Frank Hoffman is a friend, and it's an innovative term, this is no longer hybrid war. What it is constant confrontation. Lenin's opponents in the Menshevik Party were the ones who said that Lenin had introduced a state of siege into Russian social democracy. When he took power in 1917, he introduced that state of siege into world politics, or continued it because it was during World War I. This is what we see now as state of siege, or what the Russian term confrontation, protivoborstvo, means. It does not mean actual combat. And we delude ourselves, and we have people running around looking for a mission against a threat, which is only part of the threat, rather than doing what is necessary to increase our strategic understanding and leadership. But most of all, it means taking the Russian threat seriously, and it means real leadership, not leadership from behind, not going around saying that our Russian policy is one of integration into a liberal world order, and we are disappointed and surprised that Russia doesn't want this. And I can quote you the senior White House official who said this. Names are not important here. However, the point is that until we understand what is going on and what we need to do, neither we nor Europe will fully rise to the occasion. Indeed, 8 European states want to eliminate the sanctions next month, June rather, when the EU summit takes place. And the Russians are going to try and do that. But nonetheless, as we've already seen, and as the Ukrainians are telling us, another Russian offensive in Ukraine is imminent. I think it's also likely. And what's more, the nature, and this is the most critical point of all, the nature of the Russian state, which has too many similarities to fascism to go unnoticed, is one now in which empire and war, either the real thing or this constant confrontation, are genetically encoded as the means of its survival. And that option has to be foreclosed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. A very impressive presentation. I agree with you on the state of siege and world conflict, and that's a very important, I think, aspect, a way to look at this, and also for addressing the issue of the hybrid warfare, whether it's new or not so new. Vlad, turn the floor over to you.
My assignment is to speak about NATO and Europe's East in the wake of Russia's war against Ukraine. By Europe's East, I mean the 6 countries on NATO's and the EU's eastern borders that are not part of these organizations: Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. NATO has a tailored policy for each one of these countries. Of these, Armenia has conclusively cast her lot with Russia in order to be able to hold on to its territorial gains against Azerbaijan with Russia's support. Belarus, as many people increasingly realize, is trying to pursue a balanced multi-vector policy between Russia and the West. This realization is dawning belatedly on Western policymakers, but better late than never. Belarus, in an unadvertised way, very discreetly, has provided its railroad network for NATO's Northern Distribution Program to supply Allied forces in Afghanistan and then to organize the withdrawal from Afghanistan. NATO has massively used Belarus's railway network to that end. It is out of fear of Russian retaliation that Belarus has not publicized this major program. But let me start with Ukraine, which is the peg to our event today. The story of NATO-Ukraine relations is a story of enormous missed opportunities on the part of NATO. From the mid-1990s until 2007, NATO-Ukraine relations flourished, largely at the initiative of Ukraine. NATO's contribution to this blossoming of relations was the distinctive partnership charter signed between NATO and Ukraine in 1997. This document placed Ukraine on an equal footing with Russia in terms of their respective relations with NATO. The essence of the distinctive partnership charter was to establish a special track of NATO-Ukraine relations, which was supposed to run at equal speed with the track of NATO-Russia relations. That was the essence of NATO policy from the mid-1990s until the policy deteriorated around 2001-2002 under the impact of Afghanistan and the wars in the Middle East. The basic principle was equal speed for the NATO-Russia track and NATO-Ukraine track. Under that umbrella of that charter, Ukraine offered its training range at Yavoriv, one of the most desirable training ranges in the former Soviet Union, for NATO exercises, which were held repeatedly at Yavoriv. There was a proliferation of ground force, naval, and air force exercises between the Western powers and Ukraine. Some of them were multilateral NATO-Ukraine exercises, others were bilateral US-Ukraine exercises. I'll remind you their names: Sea Breeze, Cossack Steppe, Mirhorod Air Force exercise. These followed realistic combat scenarios. The period was mid-1980s and 1990s until 2007. Ukraine, under the presidency of Leonid Kuchma, came out publicly and repeatedly in favor of the right of the Baltic states to join NATO, directly contradicting Russia's position. Ukraine became the first non-NATO country to establish a joint military unit with a NATO member country, Poland, the Ukrainian Poland Joint Battalion, later enlarged with a Lithuanian troop element. Ukraine contributed massively troops to the US operations in Iraq. 14,000 Ukrainian troops participated in Iraq. All these achievements in mutual relations came to naught after 2001-2002, when the United States and major NATO powers determined that Russia was more important to NATO than Ukraine, and this marked the inauguration of a Russia-first policy on the part of NATO and on the part of the United States in terms of Europe's East. A clear Russia-first policy. The United States itself introduced the line, we need Russia on this, on that, and on the other thing. Cooperation between NATO and Ukraine unraveled, partly after the Orange Revolution disorganized the Ukrainian state and disorganized the governmental apparatus in Ukraine that had been handling and managing the privileged relations with Ukraine. Then, of course, the disorganization and disintegration of the Ukrainian state advanced under the presidency of Viktor Yanukovych, including the disintegration of Ukraine's military and security sector. These are the lost opportunities. Where are we now? The Verkhovna Rada has officially renounced Ukraine's non-bloc status and affirmed Ukraine's aspirations to join the North Atlantic Alliance. There is a political consensus on this in Ukraine. A constitutional majority of the Verkhovna Rada is in favor of Ukraine's joining NATO. This political consensus at the elite level is running ahead of the societal consensus, where there is not yet a majority in favor of joining NATO. But public opinion in Ukraine regarding NATO has become far more positive than it used to be in the past. Hardly surprising. Ukraine should not talk at this stage about joining NATO. This kind of talk alarms the Russia firsters in NATO. Ukraine should only talk about hard organic work for meeting the criteria for joining NATO at a later time. Ukraine should always emphasize in its public presentations that joining NATO is a long-term proposition that involves a lengthy and arduous period for preparations to meet criteria. Some Western governments, including the German government, are artificially raising the stakes in this debate by talking about Ukraine's accession to NATO. This, of course, automatically increases resistance to Ukraine's aspirations. Ukraine should not be part of this game. Ukraine should only talk about preparations on a long and arduous road. There is a great deal of talk about Finlandizing Ukraine. I'm frankly surprised at how experienced politicians and analysts could draw an analogy between Ukraine and Finland and their respective positions vis-à-vis Russia, or Russia's position vis-à-vis these two individual countries. Finland is an eminently defensible country thanks to its heavily forested terrain strewn with lakes and long winter. Ukraine is not defensible vis-à-vis Russia, or requires enormous efforts to organize the defense because Ukraine is flat terrain ideal for the operation of tank armies. From Russia's point of view, Ukraine is a two-way corridor, defensive corridor and offensive corridor, with, of course, greater offensive values than defensive value. Russia does not have that kind of strategic stake in Finland. Finland is a corridor to nowhere. It's a corridor to the Arctic. In history, Russia has learned how to respect Finland to a significant degree. Due to Finland's successful resistance to a Bolshevik takeover in 1918-1920, Ukraine's splendid performance in the Winter War, Finland's splendid performance in the Winter War, Finland's ability to wage the continuation war after the Winter War. All of this has earned Russia's respect vis-à-vis Finland. But contrast this with Russia's attitude toward Ukraine. It is a proprietary attitude. To Russia, Ukraine is not a state, is not a nation. Ukraine can exist only as a dependency on Russia. President Putin has gone so far as to reverse the Soviet doctrine about Ukrainian nationhood. Soviet nationalities doctrine at least recognized the existence of a distinct Ukrainian nationhood with its distinct language, which forms a basis for creating a Soviet republic in Ukraine. Putin has withdrawn that recognition. He keeps emphasizing that Ukraine is not a nation, that Ukrainian people is the same as the Russian people. Although Putin is willing to make a small exception for the far western part of Ukraine. Those are not real Russians. But for the rest, Mr. Putin keeps emphasizing that Ukraine is not a nation, or that the Ukrainian people is the same as the Russian people. Mr. Putin has rather late in his life discovered Denikin, and he has General Denikin from the Russian Civil War, and he has adopted Denikin's view of Ukraine as being a Malorossia, part of the Veliko Russia. With regard to societal characteristics, while Finland did possess the necessary societal characteristics to withstand that kind of special relationship with Russia called Finlandization, Ukrainian society does not possess those attributes. Finland is a homogeneous society, a Lutheran society, one of the least corrupt societies on earth, a disciplined society. It could, to some extent, successfully sustain that kind of relationship known as Finlandization. Ukraine lacks those characteristics. Ukraine is diverse. Ukraine is characterized by centrifugal tendencies. Ukraine is institutionally corrupt. Finlandization would conclusively destroy Ukraine. The impact of that kind of state-to-state relation between Russia and Ukraine would destroy Ukraine conclusively internally. Russia would be able to manipulate Ukrainian society on ethnic grounds, on regional grounds, by introducing even more exacerbated corruption, this time by Russian oligarchs. It would destroy Ukraine from within. Russia and Finland had a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance. That was one of the essential elements of Finlandization. Russia could, at will, invoke that treaty to exercise military pressure on Finland. Do we want that kind of element of Finlandization transferred into the relations between Russia and the Finlandized Ukraine? Certainly not. While Finlandized, Finland, the country of Finland, could not join the European Economic Community or the European Union. It was able to do so only after the end of Finlandization in 1995. If Ukraine is in one form or another Finlandized in quotation marks, then what would be the security guarantees for Ukraine? Finland had, of course, and continues to have, its reserve training and reserve mobilization system. There is no such thing in Ukraine. A Finlandized Ukraine could never have such a system. What would be the security guarantees? By a treaty with Russia, Russia has violated every single international and bilateral treaty with regard to Ukraine. Who could possibly propose signing a treaty on security guarantee for Ukraine with Russia? An unsustainable proposition. So there is no substitute for Ukraine joining a Western security organization. If some members of NATO block Ukraine's path to membership in a long term, it's premature to conclude that this would happen. But if this does happen in the medium term, let's say, then it would be a convincing case for a coalition of the willing among NATO countries concluding a treaty of assistance with Ukraine. This, of course, would reflect negatively on NATO, would reduce NATO's credibility. But if that is the only way for Ukraine to obtain security guarantees, then of course that should be the solution that recommends itself. Georgia, or rather Moldova and Georgia. At its NATO at its summit in Bucharest in 2008, as we know, NATO promised, without ifs and buts, a membership action plan for Georgia, subject to Georgia meeting the qualifications. That political commitment has turned out to be an insolvent commitment on the part of NATO. We are 7 years later now. Moldova does not enjoy that kind of relationship with Ukraine because, unlike Georgia, where more than 70% of the population, according to the latest polls, support accession to NATO, Moldova does not have that kind of support for joining NATO. Both countries, however, can take advantage of the decision of the NATO summit in Wales in September of last year to launch a defense capacity building initiative. Defense capacity building initiative. It is a political commitment by NATO to assist with the modernization of the armed forces and security sectors of Moldova, Ukraine, and the Kingdom of Jordan. NATO has singled out these three NATO countries, partner countries, from among 24 NATO partner countries to qualify for the Defense Capacity Building Initiative. The document approved by NATO does not clearly define what constitutes defense capacity building and what NATO assistance could consist of. And this offers Georgia and Moldova an opportunity to themselves define what they require in terms of defense capacity building and submit those proposals to NATO. Moldova has done so in March of this year. It has submitted a package of proposals which reflect the conclusions of a NATO needs assessment mission that worked in Moldova in 2014 and early 2015. It is now Georgia's turn to do likewise. For Georgia, NATO is a national idea, supported by the population and by most of the political elite alike. The plight of Georgia recalls in some ways the plight of the Polish nation in the 19th and early 20th century. When Poland offered troop contributions to the military campaigns of great powers in the hope that those great powers would help restore the lost Polish statehood. Poland offered troops to Napoleon, then to the Habsburg monarchy in the First World War, and to the United States and Britain, mostly Britain, in the Second World War. Those hopes remained basically unrequited. Georgia expects more from the United States and NATO. To conclude, Russia's war against Ukraine has refocused NATO's attention on the eastern neighborhood. That refocusing is very uneven among various member countries of NATO. Some member countries are in the vanguard, others are trailing. NATO is moving at the speed of the slowest ship. The slowest ship and the most powerful ship in Europe at this time is Germany. This is why it is necessary for the United States to revert to its erstwhile leadership role in terms of defining NATO's policies in Europe's East. After a decade or almost 15 years of distant expeditionary wars with no strategic payoffs, with casus belli of limited credibility, NATO can restore its credibility in its own neighborhood. Failure to devise a security solution for the neighborhood exposes NATO's own members to growing dangers. This is why one of NATO's signal failures has been that of not defining a security solution for Europe's East, and NATO should now address that issue as its top priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Vlad. And I'll turn the floor over now to Paul Goble. Paul?
Thank you, Glenn. Three preliminary comments. First, I'd like to thank Glenn and Jamestown for organizing this meeting. I think it's very important. At the same time, I would also like to thank Glenn for his overly generous words. One of the things about having been an ethnic specialist for the last 40 years is that you learn that when you're identified as one of the top 10 experts, the people are usually too polite to point out that there are only 10 experts, which make it quite as impressive as you might think. A second preliminary remark is so far you've heard from 5 people who are security specialists. Now you're going to hear from someone who isn't. I am an ethnic specialist. I am someone who looks at culture, and I have been very much impressed over my lifetime that oftentimes those who possess enormous weapons and enormous armies nonetheless watch their countries fall into pieces, and that there are a variety of other means to advance one's causes, including broadcasting and public diplomacy of various sorts, that are neglected but often can be more important, and I think we need to remember that. And third point, I had very few really wonderful experiences during my time in the government, but there was one wonderful thing it did lead to, and that was enormous discipline in terms of how long to speak. I remember to this day being forced to practice for 2 days before an Assistant Secretary of State before I gave my first briefing to a secretary, and as I had 2 minutes and 15 seconds. I'm not going to get down to 2 minutes and 15 seconds here, but I am going to be very brief. Anyone who would like a copy of my fuller remarks, ask for it, and I'll be happy to send it to you by email. And what I want to do then is to present essentially a propositional inventory, which I hope will focus our thoughts on some issues that have been only tangentially approached so far. Old generals, it is often observed, fight the last wars, and those who are forced to play defense in new ones are often quickly replaced when it turns out that the strategy they expected to work fails because the war against them has been changed. But longtime security analysts and government officials, when confronted with a radically new threat, are often slow to do so because they have even more invested in the old way of doing business than do the generals, and are even more slowly replaced by others who can see that what is true now is not what was true then, and that what worked then will not work now. Vladimir Putin, over the last 10 years, has created a radically new threat to Russia's neighbors and the international community. If we are to have any chance to respond, first and foremost, we have to understand how radically different his approach is, rather than engaging in epicycle construction and pointing out how it's just a little bit different from what we faced before. If it were just a little bit different, we might be capable of responding, but it's not. Second, we need to recognize how radically inadequate existing Western institutions are to counter that threat. The fact is, Russian tanks are not going to come over the border of Estonia at Narva. But I can tell you it is very, very likely that an FSB operation will put a Russian individual into Narva to rape an ethnic Russian girl and then complain that Estonia is doing nothing about it and demand intervention, which will be supported by the European Union and not opposed by the United States, Article 5 or no Article 5. And that's something that our current institutions and intellectual architecture doesn't deal with. And third, we need to begin to think about new institutional arrangements, both immediate and tactical and long-term and strategic, if we're going to cope with this threat, because otherwise we are going to see much worse things up front. The fact is that Crimea by itself is not nearly as important as what Crimea means everywhere else in the world. Crimea is ultimately about the South China Sea. If Putin gets away with this, other people will move, and they will do so there, among other things. What I want to do very quickly is to give you 5 ways in which I think Vladimir Putin's behavior represents a significant departure from the Soviet experience that we know something about. 5 ways in which the paradigms and institutions of the West that worked well then don't work now and won't work now. Not only don't, but won't. And third, give you 5 steps that I think we need to begin to take in order to change that situation and respond. What we have is that Vladimir Putin has changed the combination of things that Russian leaders and Soviet leaders have historically used. He has put a premium on the combination of 5 things: subversion, propaganda, direct and indirect corruption, the deployment of natural resources as a weapon, and a skillful policy of diverting attention from what he is actually doing. None of those taken in isolation is new. The way in which they are deployed in a conscious policy by Vladimir Putin is, and it is something that we lack the intellectual architecture and the security arrangements to cope with. First, subversion has always been a weapon in Moscow's arsenal. Always. Not recently, always. You shouldn't be surprised. But you should not ignore it, as we tend to do, and think that if you can have a bunch of American or NATO troops in the Baltic countries, that solves the problem. General Patton once famously remarked when he was told that he couldn't make an advance into Germany from the Ardennes because the Germans had fixed fortifications, and General Patton said, people who think fixed fortifications matter in the age of the tank are naive. You simply go around them. What subversion allows you to do is to play a weapon of the weak against the strong. And if you could have 100,000 American troops in each of the 3 Baltic countries, you could still conduct subversion against them. That's something that needs to be understood and isn't. Second, far more than his Soviet predecessors, Putin understands the media. He understands the power of television and propaganda. At precisely the time when the West has denuded itself of the capacity to use those things to promote our interests and values around the world, we are facing an opponent who's using them with extraordinary skill and being willing to spend money. I spent a lot of time at RFERL and VOA, and I'm proud of it. I am appalled to see those institutions destroyed and the way in which the destruction has been a form of suicide, I regret to say. Third, Russia has been using corruption, both direct and indirect, since the days of the Tsars, but never as boldly, broadly, and baldly as now. Because Russia understands something that Americans have never understood, and that is that when you design an active measure, you figure out how you benefit even if it fails. By which I mean, if you corrupt someone and then count on it failing, being exposed, you win then too. Americans, on the other hand, design measures on the assumption that they will succeed and do not plan for when they will inevitably fail. Fourth, Moscow is using its natural resources as a weapon, and we've talked enough about that for me. And fifth, and this is what really scares me, with far greater frequency and flexibility than any of its predecessors has demonstrated, Putin has specialized in the art of diversion, of doing something one place and then getting people to look the other way. We were all surprised that he went into Georgia at the time of the Beijing Olympics. We should not be surprised that he will look at other holidays to take advantage of that. Now, the Western response to what Putin has done is still mired very much in the past. We are still desperately trying to fit this in. People say that individuals facing massive change go through 3 stages. The first is denial. The second is search for analogy, and only then do you look for the facts. Well, we're in denial a lot of the time. Our search for analogies has led us to all the wrong places, going back to the Soviets or something else. In fact, what we are confronting with is the combination is different, and that's what we have to cope with. Putin's world has changed far more than the West's understanding of it has. First, and I'll give you 5 things. First, the Cold War was a remarkable conflict in which there was an existential and universal threat from each side to the other. That is not true now. Russia lacks that capacity, but it very much has the capacity to cause real trouble to the neighbors that are our interests. And to the extent it gets away with it, it becomes a model for the behavior of others. And I worry very much about how Beijing reads what's going on in Ukraine. I think we ought to be thinking that way. I don't think we are. Second, one of the most amazing aspects of the Cold War is something very few people talk about anymore, but which is critical. For almost 4 decades, the threat of communism, the existential threat to Western civilization, led to a remarkable alliance between people who cared about economic freedom and people who cared about democracy. That went away. And guess what? Karl Marx may have lost out in Moscow, but Groucho Marx has taken over here, both in the sense that we now think that economics drives everything, And we don't talk about politics because that's unpleasant. And because, as Groucho Marx famously said, I have my principles. And if you don't like those, I have other principles, something that we say entirely too much. Third, and perhaps the most disturbing change of all, is that the discipline imposed by the existence of mutually assured destruction is gone. It's gone. Russia cannot respond that way. It can go counter city, it can go counter force, and there are big problems about that, but I won't go into them. Fourth, Putin is advancing his causes primarily by non-military or not formally military means. You don't have to spend very much time in any of the Baltic countries to see what he is doing. But it doesn't rise to the level of being on the radar screen of most people in Brussels or Washington. And that's exactly the point. And fifth, the West, as it did during the Cold War, has somehow continued to believe that countries are driven by broad ideologies rather than being driven by national interests. It is time to stop talking about proclaiming a world of democracies as if that defined what countries will do. National interests are not the same things as ideologies, but that's exactly the way we talk. We talk as if everyone were just a liberal democracy, they'd necessarily be a friend of the United States. Please. It's so absurd, it's hard to imagine that sensible people do it. Now, what should we do? I think there are 5 steps. First, we just have to admit that Putin is a threat. We have to start using real words. Putin has invaded Ukraine. Putin is subverting his neighbors. Putin is engaged in aggression against us. Putin wants to destroy NATO, and he wants to destroy the North Atlantic Partnership. I haven't heard anybody at a very senior level say that in public. But let's start saying it because we need to get that far in order to do anything. Second, we have got to stop limiting our understanding of national security as being only about military force. National security is a far broader concept, not only in terms of how you defend it, but what it is. And what we have done, to the extent that anybody's doing anything serious, we talk about military things because we don't know yet how to talk about the others. That doesn't mean that military power isn't important. I personally hope there will be American and NATO bases on the eastern edges of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania with the cruise missiles all pointed east. And I have told my good friend, the president of Estonia, that if the balloon goes up, I am willing to come to Estonia and die for Narva. But I don't believe that military force is going to save Estonia or its neighbors. I think there are other things that have to be done. Third, Western governments must somehow figure out how to reestablish something like the coalitions between business interests and human rights activists that allowed us to prosecute the Cold War so successfully. That is our domestic challenge. It is bigger than worrying about the percentage of GDP you spend on defense. Fourth, that the West needs to recognize that in the brave new world Vladimir Putin is seeking to create, the best defense is often a good offense. And not only militarily and not primarily militarily, but in other spheres as well. And finally, the West has to plan for something that no Western leader has yet been willing to talk about. There is absolutely no way after Crimea and the Donbass that the world can return to the status quo ante. Even if Putin were to withdraw and pledge never to do anything wrong again, what he has done has got to lead to the creation of a new international security architecture, a new international system, one which, among other things, I would like to see the whole issue of the UN Security Council and its permanent members re-examined. And if we don't do that, then he will be like the famous kid in the crocodile cartoon in 1957, who, after Khrushchev's secret speech about Stalin, holds up a paper to his teacher and said, "How did it come you gave me a 0? I admitted all my mistakes." I know some buildings in this town where they would be willing to give him an A+ for that, but that's an outrage, okay? Putin and Russia must pay a price for what the Kremlin has done. And that price will not be paid just by having them stop doing it. It is going to be necessary to change things, just as it was in 1919 and 1945. This is the third great challenge. Vladimir Putin has sought to reverse the three great settlements of the 20th century. The notion that empires were illegitimate, which was the settlement of 1919, the idea that citizenship is supreme over ethnicity, which was the settlement of 1945, and the settlement after 1991 that borders are to be respected, not trampled on. All those things have been violated. All those things need to be reaffirmed. And the process of reaffirmation has to do more than just assume that we can construct a few epicycles, put a few more military personnel in place, and everything can go back to normal. The new normal is going to be something very different than anything we see now, and we need to recognize that fact. If we don't, Putin's already won, whatever happens next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I appreciate your comments and insights. Always a very, very interesting observations, that I always have from listening to you talk. I'm going to, before we open the floor to questions, there's something here I'd like to ask the panelists. And each person has a different perspective on this. Now, Steve has said that, and I think the kind of the general view here is that military means by Russia in the Baltics is really not the core issue. It's the other covert subversive means, but there's this informational side to it. And Vlad Socor, you worked at Radio Free Europe. We see the information side of the West really lagging. And I would like to ask each person, Steve, Vlad, and then last Paul, we all admit we're lagging in the information side of this war. So what needs to be done, and how can the Baltic states offset this informational, predominance by Russia for hearts and minds of Russian populations, especially in the case of, say, Latvia and in other areas, and even in Ukraine? I mean, what do we need to do? We don't have the financing available, I don't think, to create another USIA. The United States is short on funds. So do we need to do away with VOA? Do we need a new information side? Do we need to give money to the Estonian and Baltic governments to create their own information agencies? What do we need to do here? What's the problem? We don't have the resources, though, to fight this issue, I think.
Well, I'm not sure about the resources. What we don't have is the will. Resources might be, resources are a problem.
But say Joe Biden walked in your office and said,
well,
hey,
let me tell you.
What do you think we need to do here? What needs to be solved?
Given Joe Biden, I could spend an hour talking to him. But what needs to be done? Not 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Here's what needs to be done, I think. First of all, whom are you trying to target? On the one hand, you're talking about targeting Russian populations. That means you need programs that are tailored to the mentality, language, and experience of a Russian audience. That's one set of programs you need. Second is the West European and American audiences. And you need programming tailored to them. If you look at RT doesn't just throw out the same program in Argentina, for example, as it does in Ukraine. It's very different. And it's also in Spanish as opposed to Ukrainian and so on. So, one hand, you need targeted programming.
So you're saying we need to dub Seinfeld and put it in Russian?
No, we don't have to dub Seinfeld.
Start broadcasting it to the Letgale?
Let me finish. You need more than one program, first of all. Second, the Europeans have to contribute to this too. We have instruments in Europe that have already done this, like the BBC and Deutsche Welle and credible information operations. Now, I'm not familiar with the way they operate and their problems, but they have long understood the need to reach foreign audiences in a way that foreign audiences can comprehend. Third, somebody needs to get up there every day and expose the truth. Is there anybody in this room, for example, who knows how many Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine, or has a reasonable estimate?
3,000, maybe?
3,000? 4,500? 3,000? Do I hear 6,000?
Anything from 600 to 10,000.
Well, that's great. That's going to really sell. And you just made my point. Nobody is talking about that in the public. Nobody's talking to the Russians about what this war costs them on a daily basis. Nobody is exposing the lie. Nobody is exposing the subversive networks that exist, not only, in this town, which we know of, and which some of us get to read about every day in our email, but also throughout Europe. I mean, Ed Lucas has called for that. We're not doing it. So those are the beginnings of the program. There's a new study out, which I have not yet read, about BBG, about the way that needs to be reorganized. There may be wisdom in that program, in that report. The point is that you need to understand what you're dealing with. You need a program that's tailored at Russian audiences. You need to expose Putin's lies every day. The Republicans are out there and the Democrats are out there every day exposing the follies of one or another candidate. I don't know why we can't do this with Vladimir Putin. The government also needs to have a strategic understanding of what information warfare is all about. I worked in the military for 27 years. Our idea of information warfare is taking down networks and cybercrime and corrupting networks. The Russian idea is very simple. It's called mass political manipulation, or to use a term from my youth, consciousness raising, or lowering, as the case may be. They need to understand what Pomerantz is talking about in his new book, which everybody ought to read. This is the kind of thing that where you begin. There are difficult questions here that have to be resolved. But to me, the issue is not so much resources as it is understanding and political will. I see an administration that, frankly, and this grieves me a great deal, that has no concept of strategic strategy or of the willingness to lead on strategic issues, and doesn't really take Russia seriously. And President Obama has said that, basically. He doesn't see Russia as a serious threat. I mean, if we're pulling Air Force units out of Germany and are still, as Ambassador Teft said, refusing to arm Ukraine, how seriously does Washington really take the threat? Forget about us. We're not the power people. We're not the policy people. But the people who are, down the road here, who are making the decisions, obviously think that the greater threat is a bunch of terrorists in the Middle East. I happen to agree with Paul. This is not just a threat to Ukraine. This is a threat to international order. And until you understand that, you're not going to come up with the effective response. Paul, you want
I share that. I just want to make a couple of additional points. The first thing we have to understand is the rot that we're having to deal with internationally is a reflection of the rot in our own society. We have increasingly a domestic media in which facts don't exist, in which all facts are whatever anybody says they mean. We have the birther movement. We have the people of the conspiracy theories about the Kennedy execution. We have created a media environment in which people are prepared to believe that anything presented as a fact is simply an opinion, and that is something that means that we can't deal very well when we're up against people who lie professionally and well. Second, I think the resource issue is a red herring. I think what the problem is there's no political will and there's no willingness to say the obvious. The Russia of Vladimir Putin is an enemy of the United States and is an enemy to the international order and needs to be contained until there is regime change there. And I don't think we're capable of that. Third point, getting involved in, I had many bad experiences with the BBG and problems at The Voice and RFERL as well. That's not the issue. The issue is how are we going to go from the world that we had in the Cold War, which is very comfortable. It was mostly shortwave broadcasting, which you could do from anywhere in the world to anywhere else. What we have now, we went to an FM view and an internet view because FM was a disaster because you had to put it in the country you wanted to reach, which gave the country's government a veto over what you said. Reality. What we need to do, it seems to me, is to go to the next generation, which we have not been willing to do, which is direct-to-home satellite television and the production of not individual news programming, but networks. And that's going to require, perhaps, the translation of Seinfeld into Uzbek. Quite frankly, the idea of Uzbeks watching Seinfeld amuses me immensely. There will be a 30-minute program on Uzbek state television explaining what you've just heard and why you should ignore it. But never mind. The point of it is, we have another, and the last point I want to make is this. Steve is absolutely right. We're not keeping track of things. As bad as it is that we do not have both a state and surrogate broadcasting capability into this part of the world anymore, what is worse is that we are not monitoring the media there and tracking what's going on. Those of us who lived during the Cold War remember getting those wonderful salmon-colored books every day that FBIS did, translating materials from the Soviet media. That was killed. It has not been replaced. The result is that even people who ought to know what's going on don't. One of the reasons I get up every morning at 4 o'clock is I can't sleep. The other reason I get up is that I like to read what the Russians are saying about us and about other things, because I share the view of the old Jew in the shtetl who was asked why he subscribed to anti-Semitic newspapers, and he said, because I like to see how powerful we really are. I have the view that I look at what they're saying, and it is scary to me how that isn't being picked up. It's not that it can't be, it's that we failed. We destroyed FBIS, we destroyed JPRS, we have no substitutes for those things, so we're flying blind. We aren't even producing the kind of materials anymore that could be used to come up with the list of Vladimir Putin's latest lies. We're simply not. And I do every Sunday, I pick up an article that's done in Ukrainska Pravda of the top 5 Putin lies of the week. It's not nearly enough because, as I once rather infamously said on an open line at the Voice of America, I said, Putin is lying, and the interviewer said, how can you tell? And I said, he's moving his lips. So there's a large number of things that you might do. But the point of it is, we're not monitoring it. And yes, it's true that some of the European countries are doing rather better. But guess why? Because they have a state commitment to having serious broadcasting. RFI's Russian program is first-rate. The BBC Russian service is very good. But they exist because nobody sits there and says we need a public-private partnership. This is an incredibly rich country that has, for serving certain groups' interest, talked itself into the idea that we do not have the resources to do things. And once you start lying to yourself, then other people can do a lot of lying too. It is because we have not defined a goal and explained why people should be willing to pursue it. And that is a failure not only of will, but a failure of understanding. And we are going to pay a huge price. And this time around, friends, we're not going to have the several years we had after 1917 or 1941 to rebuild in order to respond. We are going to find ourselves in a much worse position, and it is going to be our own self-inflicted fault. This is, if I were writing something about where we are as a country internationally, I think the only possible title would be Assisted Suicide. Because it is tragic. The idea that we do not have the resources to be, this is an incredibly rich country. Yes, it's true, we do not have the level of free resources we had in 1946. But we still have incredible amounts of resources, unless, of course, you believe that those people who are putting away millions and billions of dollars have a divine right to those no matter what challenges are facing. And I'm getting really very tired of it. Fortunately, I have leukemia, and so it's mostly other people's problem. But I will tell you, it is appalling to me to watch this notion that the Americans don't have any money. Would that the Balts should do more? Yes, I think they should. I think 2% is way too low. But I will remind you of something. Their debates on national defense are a bit more serious than ours are, because they recognize there's a real threat out there. We haven't managed to admit there's a real threat coming from Moscow. We think the only threat we face is from higher taxes and Islamist radicals, and that's nonsense.
Vlad?
Sticking to Glenn's initial question about information warfare, we have to disaggregate the general problem from the specific Baltic problem, which is the focus of our conference today. In Europe, that's the general problem. Russian propaganda appeals largely to the malcontent conservatives. Please keep this term in mind, the malcontent conservatives. Russia is posing as the champion of conservative values in Europe. The values of national identity, religion, Christianity, family. These are the values that the current European elites seem to have either abandoned or stopped upholding. This creates enormous malcontent conservative constituencies in Europe. When Europeans talk about European values, it is a concept that is very difficult to sustain at present because Europe is split with regard to values, just as the United States is split between red and blue states. There is no longer a consensus on values in Europe. In effect, European elites who have abandoned traditional values have handed over this issue to Russia on a silver platter. Russia is exploiting with a high degree of effectiveness this abdication from values on the part of European elites and European politicians. Russia's policy of alliances in Europe, incidentally, policy of alliances is a term from the Bolshevik political warfare lexicon. Russia's alliance policies in Europe have shifted from the left side of the spectrum in the Soviet period to the right side of the spectrum today. To be sure, there are remnants, small remnants of the old communist parties that are also jumping on Russia's political bandwagon, but these are small and inconsequential. The defection of the right side of the spectrum is Russia's great success in terms of information warfare in Europe. And the best way to counter this is to restore those values in Europe before we start counter-propaganda. And so that would be the general problem. The specific problem in the Baltic states, that is a completely a unique situation in the Baltic states. In two of them, Estonia and Latvia, the population is split along linguistic lines between a majority that follows native language media outlets as well as Western media outlets, and the Russian or Russian-speaking population in these countries, which exists in a Russian informational ghetto maintained by Russia's television channels, which are producing a devastating impact in these countries on the Russian/Russian-speaking populations. And by the way, not only in the Baltic states, but also in Moldova. So this is a question of information security. Should Russia's blatant disinformation campaigns be allowed to impact this society so devastatingly in the name of freedom of information or freedom of speech? That is the other idea, the other dilemma. And finally, regarding our the ways and means of our possible response. States are notoriously bad at disseminating propaganda. I think it would be a mistake to entrust this mission to the American government or to West European governments or even to the Baltic governments. They cannot do this. In my view, the best means or the best instruments to activate in this information struggle is local civil society, in the Baltic states especially, through the networking made possible by social media and electronic media. It can be a spontaneous response. It does not have to be state organized. It does not have to be institutionalized, but it does have to be coordinated among networks of local NGOs who could, day in and day out, expose and counter the disinformation of Russian propaganda. And as a final point, it is wrong to personalize the Russian challenge as intensely as we do by reducing it to Putin's personality and using Putin, the word Putin, interchangeably with Russia or even as a representative of Russia. What we deal with, especially in the case of Ukraine, but also in the case of the Baltic states, is a process that's centuries old, a process, a Russian-Ukrainian process, which is centuries old, and the Russian policy in the Baltic states, which is centuries old. It does not depend on Putin's personality. Putin may be, almost certainly is, the most effective carrier of this historic process. He is highly competent. He has long been grievously underestimated in the West. He is highly competent, highly professional. He is trained for the job. He has a hands-on approach. He masters the dossier of individual issues, from foreign policy to diplomacy to military to energy. Putin masters these dossiers in a way that no Western statesman does. But it is wrong, nevertheless, to reduce Russia to Putin. It is wrong factually, first of all, because we have a comprehensive Russian policy of a neo-empire. But it is also wrong in a tactical way. If we so reduce Russia's policies to Putin's person, we are setting the stage for Western statesmen to rush to embrace Putin's successor in the forlorn hope that he would be different, in the way in which the West, especially the Europeans, rushed to embrace Dmitry Medvedev when he became president, in the forlorn hope that he would be a better Russian. So we are dealing with historic Russia. We are not dealing with a personality, although this personality is the most effective carrier of a Russian historic policy.
Thank you, Vlad.